Hello, this is Ms. Drake. Today we're going to talk about the different types of government, and we're also going to just generally talk about economic systems today as well. Please download a copy of the Google slides that you can find in Canvas and put that in your Google folder that you created and shared with me. First of all, let's take a look at the two categories of types of government and economies. The first is democratic. Democratic systems are controlled by the people, or citizens, that belong to a government, while autocratic and authoritarian governments that you see on the right side of your screen are generally controlled by one person or a small group of people. Let's look at each of these individually very briefly. We'll start with democracy. In a democracy, all that means by definition is majority rules. So demo, as the part of the word of democracy, refers to people. So this is where the people, the majority, rules. If you have 100 people to vote, 51 of those have to vote for a majority, 51%. Not 50, that's half. Democracy means majority rules. We have that as one characteristic of our government in America. There are two types of democracies here. Direct, where all of the people, all of the citizens get together, they talk about issues, and they vote on them. That is impossible in America today because we have over 300 million people. We have a representative democracy. Citizens will elect representatives to government to debate and decide and vote on issues for us. That then will also make America a republic. In a republic, the people who vote, the citizens who vote, hold the power, and they are going to elect representatives to government to make decisions for them. There's no monarch, which is a king or queen, and there's no offices that are inherited just because you are born into that position. We don't have that in America. However, we do have a democracy and we do have a republic. In America, we also have a president, which is part of the presidential system. The president is part of the executive branch of government, and Congress is part of the legislative branch of government. There are three branches, and here are two of those. By the way, the third branch is the judicial branch. In a presidential system, the president and Congress are very separate. They may have to work together to pass laws, but they are separate in the fact that they can't tell each other what to do, and they don't mix and mingle. Citizens will elect the president indirectly with the Electoral College, but citizens elect Congress directly in the November election. America is a presidential system. In some other types of democratic republics, they have a parliamentary system instead of a presidential system, like the United Kingdom. So taking a look, they also have three branches of government: executive, legislative, and judicial. In the parliamentary system, the executive and legislative branches are combined together somehow. In other words, they work much more closely together than what they do in the United States. For example, they don't have a president, they will have a prime minister for the executive leader. Usually their prime minister is either part of or elected by or from Parliament, which is like their Congress, their legislative branch. If they have a king or a queen, a monarch, usually that person is just ceremonial. Again, kind of like Queen Elizabeth in the United Kingdom. Now, a good thing about a parliamentary system is that generally decisions are made more quickly because the Prime Minister and Parliament work closely together. But a negative side of that is that there are fewer checks and balances than the presidential system. You see, in a presidential system that we have in America, we want to make sure that the actions of the president and Congress are checked, that neither one have too much power. Oftentimes, constitutional monarchies will also include a parliamentary system. In a constitutional monarchy, if you remember what a constitution is, it sets up its law, it sets up how government works. What happens is that there is hereditary rule. In other words, there's a king or a queen that's born into this position, but their power is very limited by that constitution. The Constitution will say the king or queen can only do these very specific things, and then the legislative and executive branches, like the Parliament and the Prime Minister, they actually run the country. So in the United Kingdom, for example, Queen Elizabeth doesn't have hardly any power at all. Really, the power comes from Parliament, which is their legislative branch, and the Prime Minister, which is from their executive branch. So I'm returning back to this slide, again, our original slide, to divide the democratic and autocratic types of government, and we've talked about so far democracy, republic, constitutional monarchy, presidential, and parliamentary systems. These other two, federalism and confederation, we're going to talk about also. Let's take a look at those two. Federalism can be very confusing because it sounds like the federal government would have all of the power, but that's not what this means. In federalism, the federal or central government, it could also be called the national government, divides power with states. For example, the United States has a federal government. Of course, the capital is at Washington, D.C. That's Congress. Our U.S. Congress makes federal laws. But there are also 50 different state governments in our country, like North Carolina has a capital at Raleigh. North Carolina has its own legislative branch called the General Assembly, and they make state laws. And so there are some things that the federal government can do, and there are other things that the state governments can do. So government powers are divided between these two different levels of government, federal and state. We will talk about more specific examples to help you remember this and how this works a little later, because this is pretty interesting. Our last type of democratic form of government is a confederation. You may have heard this in the Articles of Confederation, which is America's first constitution that didn't work, or the Confederate States of America. This is kind of the opposite of federalism that we just talked about. This is where state governments have more power than the federal, central, or national government. So what that would mean is that each of our 50 states would almost act as an independent country and would not necessarily have to follow the federal government. When we tried this with the Articles of Confederation, when our nation, of course, was first created in the late 1700s, it did not work. There were 13 different states doing 13 different things with a very weak federal government, and we could not be well organized or protected. So a confederation for us in America did not work because it didn't do what the government was supposed to do, which is protect people's rights. So again, returning back to this chart, we've talked about all of those red types of democratic governments that are listed on the left. We will talk about economies later on, but I just want to point out that typically in democratic governments, they have capitalism, which is also called the free enterprise system, free markets, or mixed market. And they can have some elements of socialism in them, which just means that the government is a little bit involved in what the people are doing and makes laws about the economy to protect people and businesses. So we will talk about those later. On the right-hand side, we're going to talk now about autocratic or authoritarian types of government. Let's start with absolute monarchy. So this is pretty simple to understand. This is where a king or a queen has total power regardless of any other laws, that they have the final say. Usually they inherit this. That's hereditary rule. So when the king has a son, then the son becomes the king. That often doesn't happen in our world today because we like democracy. People like to have a voice in their government. but an example of this today is in Saudi Arabia or Qatar. Dictatorships are probably something that you're familiar with. You've probably heard that before, like in Cuba. People here in this type of government don't have a lot of freedoms or civil rights. The dictator usually takes power by force and relies on the military or police to maintain control. Like, for example, in China. It's strange, China has elections, but you can only elect people from the Communist Party. So that's not really a free choice, and that's not really democratic. Now, if you go beyond a dictatorship, someone with even more power, you would be talking about totalitarianism. Notice, of course, how we have the root total in that word. The person in totalitarianism who's the leader has total control over everything. They control all aspects of society. What's produced in the economy, their religious beliefs. Generally, they're discouraged from having religion because they want the totalitarian leader to be worshipped, and they don't have a lot of freedoms. As a matter of fact, they ban or get rid of all opposition groups. There's only one party, and they use propaganda and the media and terror to maintain control. This would be like Nazi Germany or even North Korea today. We have an oligarchy. This doesn't really exist very often, but oligarchy, not Olive Garden, oligarchy means a rule by a small group of people. Something like if a family was going to rule. So maybe you had brothers and sisters that ruled together. Well, you probably then understand why this doesn't last very long, because usually one of those people will want to take power and control for themselves, and sometimes will even kill or get rid of somehow the other people in the oligarchy. And last, we have aristocracy. Aristocracy is ruled by the nobility. The nobility are going to be the relatives of the king, like the cousins of the king, a duke, a duchess, an earl. Those are the people in the nobility, and so they would be the rulers in an aristocracy. Again, that doesn't happen often in our countries today. And again, coming back to our types of government and economic systems, again, the left-hand side, democratic, the right-hand side, autocratic. We've talked about the autocratic types of government. So what kind of economies do they generally have? It's generally controlled by the government. That's either called a command economy because it's commanded by the government. It's communism. It can also have a high degree of socialism, like Cuba, for example. In Cuba, people do have some free choices about, say, running businesses, but most of the businesses that make a lot of money, like the banking industry and transportation, those are going to be owned by the government. That has a high degree of socialism. So I'm going to bounce to the end of our slide presentation, and I want to point out that what I've done here is try to put all of the types of government that we've talked about on one slide for your quick reference, because you're going to have to play a Kahoot and then practice your knowledge with a Quizlet. So if you get stuck, you can refer to this. I would like for you not to, because you're going to have a quiz on these types of government, and you have to be familiar with what these are. Now, I also have, just for later, notes that we're going to talk about when we talk about economies. I have more information about capitalism, socialism, and command or communism, but we don't need to talk about that now. But it is still part of our notes here if you want to look at that. And then I have other types of government and economic systems, like anarchy, which you guys seem to be familiar with. That's just where you don't have a ruler. Theocracy is ruled by religious beliefs that generally doesn't exist today. In Iran, they do because they're controlled by Islam. But those are just some other types of government and economic systems. So again, I hope these notes are going to be helpful for you to organize the different types of government and then be more specific about what they are. The democratic types, controlled by citizens or the people, are on the left, and the autocratic or authoritarian types are on the right. The end.